Okay, we're going to start this next panel. Okay. Yep. All right. Hello, everybody. If you can all take your seats again, we got one last panel, and we have a great panel. It's an important panel. So this is actually the last event of the day. As some of you know from our invitation, we had a final discussion set up between Admiral Locklear and Sharon Burke, and that was going to be after this panel, and that was going to last for about a half an hour and sort of just cover a bunch of the issues that we have discussed today, but sort of bring some of the military perspective to those issues. Unfortunately, Sharon and I learned a couple days ago that Admiral Locklear was sort of called abroad for today, so he wasn't able to make it. So anyway, so this last panel will last an hour, and after that, we'll have some coffee, and I hope you stick around. And I think we may even have some cookies, so stick around for some coffee and cookies. So this last panel, I'm going to let Matt do the introductions of the panel, but I'm going to introduce Matt. Matt's a good friend, a very good friend, and he is, I'll just go straight to it, he's, this is the boilerplate, he's the budget analyst on the Senate Budget Committee. And he's also a senior policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Some of you may have heard of that fellow. Now, Matt's here, he's speaking on his own. He's not representing anyone else today other than his own views. Matt has a very colorful past, and he's had a lot of different jobs in a lot of different places. But I think what's pertinent for us today is that he has written a lot, thought a lot about industrial organization, monopoly power, market structure, international trade, and relations among nations. And his writing on these issues has appeared in the New York Times, in Vice and Salon, in the New Republic, and in The Nation, among other places. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Barry, and thank you, New America, for putting this marvelous event on. So this panel is called Systems and Power, Who Really Rules? So it's not a very ambitious title, but it's pretty remarkable. We have a great group of thinkers up here to talk about our trading system and how it interacts with the Western and American system of technology, science, and manufacturing. So I'm going to describe how the panel is going to work and give intros to the, I think, really wonderful group of thinkers that we have here. So to describe the big picture and the exact nature of the problem, we have a giant in the field of industrial engineering and also policy thinking. Ralph Gomery is the former Senior Vice President for Science and Technology at IBM and the former President of the Sloan Foundation. He is a mathematician and was awarded the National Medal of Science by Ronald Reagan. And he currently researches the complexities of the globalized economy and the differing goals of countries and companies. He's co-author of the MIT Press book, Global Trade and Conflicting National Interests. I have the book right here. It really is amazing. It was published in 2000 when most of the world was thinking about the end of history. Mr. Gomery was actually thinking about this new fragile trading system as it was emerging and the underpinning of international economics. So he's going to talk about that. Then we're going to learn from a key official or former official in the Obama administration, Ilana Breutman, who's going to talk about how she thinks policymakers are thinking about the problem and possible solutions. So Ilana is speaking only for herself, not for any not for the administration or anyone else, or for any, she's at a law firm right now, but not for any clients. These are just representing her personal views, not her, not legal advice or anything else. She's a shareholder at the international law firm Greenberg Traurig, where she provides expertise on foreign investment in the United States, cybersecurity, defense procurement, and sanctions. Previously, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Manufacturing and Industrial-Based Policy at the Department of Defense, where she represented the department on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And before that, she was a senior advisor to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand on foreign policy issues, foreign relations. Then we are going to learn about the intellectual origins of this trading system and the intellectual choices that were made in the 1990s to bring it about. We have with us Time magazine reporter Haley Edwards. She is a correspondent and an author. She's got a great new book out. It's called Shadow Courts, The Tribunals That Rule Global Trade. It's short, it's a very good read. She analyzes a provision in trade agreements that allows foreign investors to sue sovereign nations outside their court systems, really looking at a new system of international law. Finally, we are going to have Alan Riley, who is a British antitrust expert and a really original thinker. He is going to talk about innovative European approaches to dealing with our trading system and specifically state-owned enterprises. Alan is, let's see here. I have your bio right here. Alan is a senior fellow at the Institute for Statecraft, Temple Place, London, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington. He specializes in energy, antitrust, and security issues. He has a major paper appearing shortly on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project with the Center for European Policy Studies, and has a book on China, The Potemkin Dragon, China, a Danger to Itself and the World, which is being published by Amazon. So, with that introduction, Ralph, please.
Well, it's really both an honor and a pleasure to be here. And the subject matter, I just think, is so enormously important. And I think we have to be thinking about changing our ways, and I'll talk about that. Because we have to realize that the real world that we live in is not a world of textbook free trade. Rather, it is in fact a world of mercantilism, a world in which many foreign governments will do whatever it takes to make their industries succeed. And China is a great example, right? And if they sign something and they don't do it, that's in their national interest, and they will not do it. Right? In this mercantilist world, our great American companies can maximize their profits by taking their technology and know-how to Asia. And there, as Clyde remarked this morning, there they can get subsidies in the form of underpriced currency, ready-built factories, tax incentives, and sometimes cheap labor. And China or other countries can add enough in subsidies to make outsourcing to their country, China, let us say, very profitable. And our companies will go right ahead and outsource because they believe that their mission is to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. They believe it is someone else's job to take care of the impact on the American economy. We have to realize that what is good for our global corporations and what is good for our national economy has diverged. There is a fundamental conflict. Also, in this mercantilist world, the free trade benefits used to justify most of our trade agreements, say those with Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and many other countries, those free trade benefits we learned about in school, they do not occur. Right? Rather, these agreements have often opened our industries to destructive, non-market competition. And that destruction is not balanced by increased exports. So we end up in all these agreements with unbalanced trade. And that means that we are trading jobs and also very often technology and the actual ownership of our own economy for corporate profit. And we're trading that at the rate of $500 billion a year, which is not nothing. Right? There is also another trade development that also, again, is less benign than textbook free trade, though it uses that name. Building on a trend that started with NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, WTO, the TPP, obviously not one of my favorites, has buried in its 6,000 pages dispute settlement clauses that give corporations the power to sue governments. Corporations sue governments of countries they do business in if that country takes any steps that hurts their profits or even their projected profits. If the TPP should be accepted, which I hope it will not be, it will be an extraordinary grant of legislative and judicial power to corporations so large and so all-encompassing as to actually undermine our democracy. Now, that may sound like an exaggerated statement, and I haven't got time to explain, but it is very strongly my belief. Clearly, in the short run, we should have no more of these unbalanced trade agreements, and no TPP in particular. But we need to ask, in the longer run, what is it we can do for the US economy, not in the dream world of textbooks, but in the actual mercantilist world in which we live? In the United States, the traditional tools that we have used, and we used them for a long, long time, to effect industrial action have been two: tax incentives and tariffs. We have a long actual history of tariffs. Right? We have used, for example, R&D tax credits to spur R&D. So why not tax credits then for companies with high value added in the US? We could make the corporate tax, income tax lower for those that produce in the US and higher for those who are primarily outsourcers. I'm just giving a few points here. There's lots more. And next, to balance trade and stop selling the country out from under us at $500 billion a year, Warren Buffett has proposed a very simple system which he calls import certificates. We could also call it the Buffett tariff, which is this. If you are an exporter, you are given import certificates in the amount of your exports. So if you export $10 million, you get $10 million worth of certificates. And you sell these certificates in an open market. Any importer cannot import into the US without first buying import certificates. Okay? So import certificates automatically balance trade. Not like all this thing, do this, maybe it'll balance. This would balance trade, all right? You wouldn't do a thing like this abruptly. You'd have to phase it in so that the industries which are essentially being sheltered by this can adapt. But it can be done. That is the point I'm making. So that I'm saying there are things you can do about this. Note that in all this, it is the devotion to profit as the only goal that make us look for these incentives and these tariffs. And perhaps we should pause and ask, is that really the right motivation for our great corporations? Now, corporations have not always acted this way. From the Second World War up to about 1980, the accepted corporate view was called the Stakeholder View. And that view, which was completely widely accepted, was that the corporation needed to balance the needs of many groups: customers, employees, community, society at large, suppliers, and shareholders. The present shareholder primacy doctrine only came in during the 1980s, when the shareholders used huge grants of stock options to the executives, which would in fact gave them the possibility of becoming rich beyond their previous wildest dreams if only they can get the stock price up. Okay? This motivation, right? A greater incentive to outsource or to find other ways to keep wages down and stock price up could not be imagined. It was effective, and that's what did happen, right? It has led us to today's corporations with their flat wages, with their successful tax avoidance schemes, and their stock buybacks, right? And in addition, given this motivation, which we accept, that they should just think about profit, we accept that their most destructive actions, which often affect millions, are only punishable by fines. Is this what we want of our corporations? It is certainly not what President Theodore Roosevelt wanted when he, in 1901, addressed Congress as follows: "Great corporations exist only because they are created and safeguarded by our institutions. And it is therefore our right and our duty to see that they work in harmony with our institutions." Are we doing that duty by having moved in 1980 to a style of capitalism that benefits large shareholders who are mainly rich at the expense of wage earners who make up the backbone of this country? Are we doing that duty when we open our economy to destructive, mercantilist exploitation and takeover because, under this rule, our rule, everything is for sale to the highest bidder without any consideration of the effect on our economy? All this strongly suggests that it is time to rethink shareholder primacy and, more generally, the behavior of our great corporations, because that is what lies at the heart of our problems. Thank you.
Ilana.
Hard to follow that one. Is this on? So I want to start with maybe a provocative sentence, which is that today's concerns about China's takeover of the U.S. economy are not that dissimilar from the panic over the Japanese or even the Gulf states' foreign direct investment of the earlier decades. In the past, both may have overestimated the eventual risks to the U.S. manufacturing base, but they actually led to the passage of important statutes that became known as CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Where I would agree with what I think we've heard most of the day, and certainly on this panel, is that China really is fundamentally a different story. It's a state-controlled economy, both politically and economically. Even firms that are not SOEs or state-owned enterprises are often subject to government pressure and government policy. Moreover, China is the largest potential consumer market, giving it the ability to leverage U.S. economic interest to grossly impact policies. And finally, China, perhaps like Japan before it, subsidizes its products, both directly and through lax employment, environmental, and other laws that allow their products to compete on an unfair basis, even if you had the best trade agreement. China's voracious appetite for U.S. investment, and Europe, I might add, however, is not simply a government dictum. It's a natural progression of Chinese companies and investors seeking stability, new markets, and know-how. These acquisitions ought to make China more exposed as well, and by driving up business costs at Chinese firms, that's always the theory, right? You compete more on the global market, you drive up your own costs, you move up the value chain, and you make Chinese products compete on a more even playing field. In sum, before I get into the details, my view is that cross-border trade and investment are, in a large part, cyclical issues. But the strong caveat here is that China poses a longer-term threat than have other countries because of the fundamentals of the Chinese political environment and economy. The response to this phenomenon is difficult to manage solely through government policy. First, U.S. companies are wary of cutting their sales markets or investors. Let me take a sanctions example. This summer, the Chinese smartphone maker ZTE Corporation, not the summer, last spring, was to be sanctioned. There was a public announcement. It was to be sanctioned for selling products to Iran with U.S. equipment, which is prohibited under U.S. sanctions. Shortly thereafter, they were extended a reprieve. That reprieve's now been extended twice, currently lasting until November 28th. Now, they happen to have a significant market, they happen to be a significant market for the U.S. semiconductor and other hardware manufacturers. So sanctioning a foreign entity in that case is not a simple equation, and may have been impacted by the U.S. companies as much as U.S. policy thinkers. Chinese acquisitions in the U.S. are growing. The latest CFIUS report from the Treasury Department put them at the largest share of notices filed for the 2012 to 2014 period, which is the last period that's been reported to Congress, with about 20% of the CFIUS notice filed being associated with China. Where Chinese investors that are being filed coming in, manufacturing still leads, but technology is increasingly the focus, as we know from even China's own latest official plan, and from its notable acquisitions, both in the US and in Europe. In the critical tech sectors, these are defined in the CFIUS report, China was 5th among 28 countries whose investors are making US acquisitions. Under US law, investments or acquisitions associated with foreign government ownership receive additional scrutiny by law. With China, though, government influence is often indirect. An interesting example recently in a Chinese acquisition of a German technology company, all covered by a couple of articles, really good articles in the New York Times. The New York Times made an interesting analysis. The German company's share price plummeted last year, in part because a very significant Chinese customer canceled a large order. This year, the German company agreed to sell itself to a different Chinese entity, a Chinese investor. The interesting thing is there's a web of connections between the Chinese firms, the customer that stopped buying and the investor that came in when the stock share plummeted. Not my findings, New York Times. And again, in the Times articles, there are certain linkages between that investor and the Chinese government. Again, not direct ownership, it's not an SOE, but linkages. When CFIUS examines filings for acquisitions in the United States, the intelligence community has an important seat at the table and raises such facts as government connections, as it must under the law, because there's the CFIUS statute actually requires a certain type of review when there's a government ownership to an investor. But it's often difficult for the committee to decide how to treat indirect connections, particularly in the face of greater and greater pressure for more inbound FDI. And US law doesn't even begin to address so-called greenfield investments. By the way, neither do European countries, from what I could tell. There's no national security mechanism to address, for example, a Chinese investor launching a new business with physical assets, for example, purchased in the U.S., hiring U.S. STEM graduates, including many who have originated from China, for example, and experienced engineers from other companies to exploit the talent base here, and then doing business here in the U.S. and perhaps including with the U.S. national security environment. So that's an issue that had raised concerns in the past, but has never been patched by U.S. law. This kind of intellectual property issue that's highlighted in the last example is another significant imbalance, of course, in the Chinese relationship with other developed countries, including the U.S. U.S. firms have for years complained about IP theft and reverse engineering that happens in China or that stems from China. Due to alleged hacks attributed to China, of course, you don't have to invest in China to have your IP at risk. We've seen significant cyber attacks reported that come into the U.S. But again, while our tech giants have privately complained about this risk, they have continued to open factories in China and shy away from USG action on their behalf. A notable example in 2010 was when Google went public in accusing China of hacking and censoring its systems, prompting also a USG diplomatic overture. Google, frankly, from what I could tell, faced some repercussions, and most companies are simply not willing to be as public. I'd say the Obama administration has done more than previous ones to try to institute cyber norms, including some international cyber norms. In 2011, the White House issued an international cyber strategy. There, as in other areas, there are some good rules and some good policies on the books, but it's very, very difficult to actually put teeth to them. And what has been suggested in Congress, for example, in the past is report cards about bad cyber policies of foreign countries and potentially even sanctions. And that, I think, we're a ways off from implementing. The issue with any of this is the willingness to call out bad actors and institute sanctions, trade actions, call for equal treatment under worker protection, environmental laws, all the kinds of things that uneven a playing field. But there are many competing policy priorities, whether they're economic or foreign policies, in our diplomatic relationship, in our consideration of our own laws. And that makes it obviously difficult to implement. But I would say it's not just, I know that this was billed as what are our fundamental legal rules and what is the Obama administration or other administrations doing. I'd say it's not just a government approach, because the private sector plays a significant part in both reporting and working with government in trying to address some of these issues. Thank you.
I was going to talk a little bit more about the intellectual structures of trade agreement, of how we think about trade and how it's shifted over the last, since the 90s, basically. But after hearing Ralph and Alana's comments, I'm actually going to go a little bit more off the cuff and go back a little bit farther. In events like this, it's easy to get buried in the details and just get lost in the wonky bits. But I think that the overarching reality of how we think about trade and how we think about our relationships in the world over the last 50 years has changed so dramatically that it's easy to lose track of that. So let's go back to end of World War II, and that's really when we saw the GATT and the Bretton Woods agreements and the first discussion of the International Trade Organization and all these sorts of things. That the entire discussion then was framed around the idea of economic dependency and prosperity and peace. It was in the wake of World War II where people were afraid of creating another world war. They wanted trade agreements because they wanted to foster economic dependencies between nations. And that was, there were pros and cons. You can argue about the GATT not being so great in a lot of ways. The dispute settlement system was basically a joke, among other things. But from 1948 till about 1990, you saw global GDP rise by about 7% per year. You also saw that was in a system that allowed countries to do whatever they wanted inside of their own countries. So this is an important distinction from the GATT and all of these other and all of these early trade agreements. When we think about the rise of globalization in the 1960s, we're talking about a fundamentally different thing now. For the first 40 years, we were talking about, as Ralph put it, the entire point wasn't raising corporate profits. It was that the frame was through prosperity and peace. And in the 1990s, that fundamentally changed. And one of the reasons for that was this Libertarian Revolution in the 1980s. You saw, the Washington Consensus. I'm seeing some nods in the audience. And the neoliberal mentality sweep the entire world. The entire idea was like, why do we even have governments involved at all? Why do we have any sort of non-trade tariffs, any sort of trade tariffs? Why are there any rules whatsoever? Shouldn't the free market control this? And that is really the intellectual framework that took control in the 1990s. And that is the intellectual foundation that gave rise to NAFTA. And that's the intellectual foundation that gave rise to the WTO. And this whole slew of other trade agreements that we've seen since then. So we can argue over whether or not that benefits American workers, or that benefits corporations, or it benefits transnational corporations, where those are all interesting discussions, and you can battle over the statistics, but you have to fundamentally see it as a fundamental shift in strategy. And one aspect of that Ralph touched on a little bit, and that my book is about, is that for the first time ever in the 1990s, you saw investor protections be put into trade agreements. And that, again, is just totally new. And I think it's easy to lose track of this. But the idea that you would put into a trade agreement a chapter or a provision that allows foreign investors to challenge sovereign nations through arbitration tribunals outside of their court system in order to, and the fundamental goal of that was protecting private property rights in the countries where you're investing. That didn't exist. That would have been you would have been laughed out of Bretton Woods in 1945 for suggesting that. It would have been completely unheard of in the 1970s. Frankly, it was like pretty touch and go in the 80s. The U.S. didn't even have didn't sign on to a trade agreement that included investor protections until the 1980s, because it was seen as an encroachment on sovereignty and on the ability of a nation to choose whichever domestic policies it needed to choose in order to get to full employment, pursue environmental ends, pursue social justice, whatever other priorities a nation had, those were given more ground. And then after these investment protections were put in there, it provided a provision that allowed investors to challenge a sovereign nation outside of its court system. Now, if you just kind of hover above, get 30,000 feet above the last 50 years and look down, that's a pretty substantial shift in intellectual, in vision for what we want out of our global trade regime. And I want to finish it by looping back to China and a lot of what Alana was saying. What we're seeing now is, just to quote some of the statistics that she used, China is the 5th of 28 countries making U.S. acquisitions in the U.S. China's a huge investor in the U.S. The U.S. is a huge investor in China. And these are theoretically private corporations, definitely private on our end, going to China. But on their end, coming here, these are theoretically private corporations that are very much state-controlled in a lot of ways. And now they have access to these same investor protections. Theoretically, right, China's not, of course, a signatory of the TPP, but that's the global trade regime that we are pushing for right now. The entire point of having the TPP as an agreement that can be docked up to is so that China can join it in the future. And it creates a new world order that would be fundamentally different than anything we've seen in the past. And and I think I'm at my limit here, but I would just urge everybody to, when you're thinking about trade agreements, don't just try not to get mired in the details. When you think about the role of China on the international stage, think about it in terms of comparing to 40 years ago, or comparing to 20 years ago, rather than just looking at the number of, or the amount of foreign direct investment available today. Thanks.
Thank you. And Alan, a number of provocative ideas have come up, and I hope you'll talk about how the Europeans are thinking about this, what is a very similar problem, because it was a global system after World War II that we're wrestling with.
Yeah. I'm going to give you a few, I'm going to try and look at solutions rather than just talk about problems. And I'm going to give you some hope to start with. Because, of course, the European Union has a kind of problem. When I talk about the European Union, I should point out the United Kingdom is still a member state, as far as I can tell. All 28 of us. And we have a serious geopolitical problem. It's not, of course, Chinese dragon, it is Russian bear. And the point I think is worth making here is that there are, I mean, I know the European Union gets a terrible press for being rather ineffectual, and of course a very terrible press in the UK recently. But in fact, on dealing with the Russian bear, and particularly dealing with the major leverage it has in Europe, which is natural gas, the European Union has actually developed an effective response mechanism. And that has become stronger and stronger over the last decade. And it starts with the observation that at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians had relatively few levers. And the one big lever they had was natural gas. All the pipelines which flowed from east to west, providing gas to both Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And essentially, the Russians sought to rebuild a lot of their power and influence along those pipelines by doing soft price deals, by long-term supply contracts, and by essentially locking up the market and playing off one East European state along another. I mean, there's a Swedish Defence Research Agency have this great report. It's about 500 pages long on all the Russian deals which were done, and also the cut-offs. There's about 40 politically motivated energy cut-offs between 1991 and 2004. Now, when most of these states joined the Union, what does the EU do? And to some degree, what they did is they simply relied upon their own rules. They relied upon their own systems. So the EU begins to integrate the gas markets of Central and Eastern Europe into the EU's gas market. They start applying and developing the liberalization rules. They apply the antitrust rules. And it was simply applying our rules with some adaptation, which allowed us, and agreed, and also persistence, which allowed us to begin to break that geopolitical threat to the Union. To the extent now that you have got an increasingly integrated single market, you've got a single set of legal rules, and the Commission is bearing down with its antitrust case. And so most of the mechanisms and the levers that Gazprom had to control various European markets have been broken. And what I would argue is that whilst it's not perfect, it's not complete, it is much, much better than it was. And what I think the lesson that the US can take from this is that a lot of the problems we're facing in relation to China are in many ways addressable, and addressable by our own structures, our systems, and our legal rules, or with some adaptation. So let me just briefly say, to give you a few examples. If you actually asked, briefly, what are the problems? One is the closed market, the non-reciprocal access. In fact, since about 2006, the Chinese markets have been closing rather than opening. The second is the dumping of product on global markets. I mean, the global steel capacity has increased 57% since 2004. 91% of it is Chinese. 91% of that increase is Chinese. All of that increase has been funded by non-market loans by state banks. Again, a non-market response. They have, at the same time as all of that, they're massively insisting or pushing as far as they can their WTO access in the rest of the world, and whilst increasingly acquiring assets in the rest of the world, including the US. So what do we do about it? We simply do what we do with our rules. So we apply our trade defense measures more vigorously and more rapidly. We perhaps adapt them to the threat from Chinese dumping. We take account perhaps more clearly of the state funding issues. We look at IPOs. I mean, one of this book I've just written, Potemkin Dragon, one of the issues that I uncovered, which I find quite amazing really, is that since the first IPO in 1993 by Shanghai Petroleum, not a single Chinese state-owned enterprise on any Western exchange has ever disclosed the extent of the Chinese Communist Party committees and their operation in the firm. They've never disclosed the role of SASAC, the state shareholder company, or the role and influence of the state-funded bank, the state-owned and controlled banks. Now, given the fact that the concept of material non-disclosure is usually applied substantially in any IPO system anywhere in the West, on any Western exchange, that does raise some questions. And it's interesting if you compare it, when Rosneft did a IPO in London in 2007, then there was pages and pages of disclosures. We are controlled by the Kremlin. We are owned by oligarchs. We have a whole series of things which you might like to think about before you invest in us. Nothing like that with any of the Chinese IPOs since 1993. So apply our own rules. The antitrust rules, I think there is a lot we could do there by simply first of all, recognizing the scope of state control, that it's not just to state-owned companies, it's also to so-called private companies. That if you have a situation where the state provides all the funding in the country through their policy banks at non-commercial, with no proper commercial risk assessment, then you have to consider in principle that any significant Chinese company is one way or another owned or controlled by the state. And that's reinforced by the role of all the party committees in every single private company, and then all the state-owned enterprises. So in antitrust terms, that means you have to look when you're looking at any deal, any merger, you've got to actually look at all of the Chinese companies in the sector when you do your merger assessment. And then there's the issue of foreign investment review. And one of the troubles I have with CFIUS is it just doesn't capture what is going on. It doesn't, when it look at state control, it doesn't look at the so-called private businesses, which are not private businesses. It doesn't look at the issues of state funding. It doesn't look at the acquisition and lockdown strategies. For example, if you take the ChemChina-Syngenta deal, in that case, one of the worries I have about it is that neither the antitrust rules nor CFIUS currently capture the potential that ChemChina will simply now stuff Syngenta full of cheap Chinese capital. It will lock down all of the markets in China, so nobody can actually otherwise sell. No Western company can come in. And essentially, it will lock down the market for any Western competitor. Then it will grow the new company up as strong as possible, and then it will be able to use the WTO rules to then charge into other markets and undermine the Western competitors. And there's an element to this as well, which I think is about not just about the US, is that one of the holes in the fabric of dealing with this is not just a matter of the US extending CFIUS and making it work more effectively and dealing with these sort of issues. The EU needs to do it as well, because the danger is if the EU doesn't have an effective foreign investment review system, and currently it has none, then all that will happen is China will go to Europe and it will take over companies in Europe and use them for the acquisition lockdown strategies, and then turn the super company they've created round on the US. So it's really important also to ensure that the Europeans create an effective foreign investment review system as well. But the point about all of this is possible. We don't have to tear up the global trading system. We can use our own mechanisms and measures to deal with these problems with a bit of adaptation and get the Europeans involved as well. Okay, I'll stop there.
So there's so much to talk and think about here, and so I'm going to start with a very kind of somewhat open-ended question, which I think is, well, I'll start with the person, Margaret Vestager, who's in DC this week and has kind of addressed, she's really strengthened the use of the EU's rules around tax havens, antitrust, and not just, one could look at it and say that what she's doing is strengthening it on the part of sort of the Western nations in general, protecting key assets, corporate assets, and making corporations governable again. Or one could say she is operating to strengthen European corporations at the expense of American corporations with her investigation of Google and with the Apple tax matter. What do you think about what she's doing? Is that fundamentally helping protect our assets from this onslaught of Chinese investment? Or is she disrupting a working global regime?
Okay, there's quite a lot to unpack there. I mean, one of the points about the cases, all the kind of the Google case, is all the software antitrust cases, where there are a lot of American critics who look at that and say how terrible this is, kind of European prejudice. The point to first of all realize is that virtually all the complaints that are received in relation to these cases are from American corporations. And that's the first thing to point out. The second is that what I think you're going to see is that Mrs. Vestager is leading the charge, and the FTC and the DOJ will be following shortly. And I think the issues raised in relation to Google, for example, are not going to go away. You have I mean, it's not just one case. There are a series of questions about the operations of Google and what the Europeans call the abuse of dominance, which monopolization, I suppose, under Section 2, which are not, which are clear. There are a whole series of questions, whether you take Google's position or not, which are going to be raised again and again as we work out how to effectively keep a digital markets open. And so I don't think that's going to go away at all. And you could say that the Europeans are leading on this. On the tax issue, I mean, one of the arguments is that you could argue that the European Commission is doing the US taxpayer a favor, because as a result of bringing these tax cases, it's very much more likely that the US companies will start repatriating a substantial amount of the overseas cash they've got back home. So it's much more likely that Uncle Sam's going to get a very large check as a result of this. So, you know, and then it does also raise a bigger issue about when you actually look at the what the Apple, I don't particularly focus on Apple, but when you look at a situation where you've got a lot of multinational companies putting themselves in a position where they're effectively paying tax nowhere, and through a whole series of interesting maneuvers. And then there's a lot more to come out of this. We've not yet seen the full prohibition decision with all the details, which I think is one of the reasons why the Commission is in the position it's in, is that they've only been able to publish a brief press release. And the reason they can't publish it is that Apple is arguing over the details, claiming commercial confidentiality. Once we get the full document, I think that will show up what's really been going on.
So, Haley, just to follow up on that, do you think that what Vestager is doing, it represents significant pushback to the libertarian intellectual strain that you were talking about that emerged in the 80s?
I haven't thought about it in those terms yet, but yes, in general, I think that we are seeing right now the realization that antitrust stopped being enforced about 30 years ago. And I think that you are just in terms of, it's very intertwined with the rise of populism, both here and in Europe, I would say. And there's a lot of anger there. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what we're actually seeing. And, but yeah, I think that we are seeing the beginnings of a backlash to what a lot of people see as corporate dominance of certainly the American political process.
I think the other point to recognize is that whereas Section 2 was largely, by the US courts, was largely sort of cut off of all its corners and reduced in effect, that never really happened in Europe. And the more traditional, if you like, pre-neoliberal approach certainly remained in the EU courts. The EU courts kept that position. The Commission took a more liberal view. But I think you could see a reassertion of the traditional approach to the application of the abusive dominance provisions. So I think that's another part of this, and that's one of the reasons why the EU can move ahead much more quickly than the DOJ or FTC.
That's interesting. So that's a really interesting point. To get back to China for a second, Ralph, how do you see the Chinese specifically using the global trading system to pick off American or Western scientific and technological assets?
Well, I would like to, before I reply, I'd like to make one thing clear. Whatever the Chinese treatment of their own people is, I'm just talking about their economy. And I think that they're doing a great job for the Chinese economy, okay? I'm not trying to demonize China. I'm trying to demonize us, our companies, and their profit fixation. That's my villain, right? And the Chinese, trying to lift their own country, are intelligently exploiting our weaknesses. So it's up to us to do better, right? Okay, now with that background, what,
Well,
yeah.
okay, so how are, let me rephrase the question.
Yes.
How are our multinational enterprises allowing China the Chinese state government to pick off our
well,
scientific
it's this sort of
assets?
thing. I mean, the company, well, supposing you're a large company and you want to have a share of the Chinese market, for example, well, you're willing to give up a certain amount of stuff to do that, right? And so if you say, well, I mean, as a matter of fact, what's the company that makes Corning? Yeah, I once had a conversation with the head of Corning, and they wanted to put a glass. You know, Corning was responsible, very to a large extent, to optical fiber, right? Right. So they talked to China about Corning making optical fiber in China, okay? And in the end, they did not agree. And they did not agree because the Chinese would only agree to Corning making a little plant, and Corning wanted to make a big plant, right? What the Chinese preferred was, hey, Corning makes a little plant in China. We learn how to do it. Then we make the big plant, right? Now, Corning chose that way. Many companies chose the other way. That is, hey, we'll give you the wherewithal to build a big plant. Right? Or we'll build a little plant and we'll let you build a big plant. We're willing to give up more to be in the Chinese market than Corning was willing to. So that's a fairly typical tip. They're willing to give up a lot to get into the market. Now, I think that's a short-sighted thing in the manufacturing area, because it seems to me the Chinese government has made it very clear that in manufacturing, they want to be the manufacturers in China, okay? And so I can empathize with that. Yeah.
So, Alana, a question for you. You, in your statement, so you've talked about cybersecurity, sanctions, trade, but also about gaps in governance. Is our government capable of dealing with this problem? Do we need some sort of government restructuring to strengthening of CFIUS, something along those lines, to make sure that we're not allowing too much leverage to Chinese state-owned enterprises or anyone else?
I think that we could have strengthened rules. The actual statutes themselves have some gaps that have arisen over time as we've put them into practice. So I mentioned greenfield investments really are not covered. There are certain kinds of investors who come in through certain visa provisions. They really don't get covered. The focus is national security. I'm not sure I agree that we should have a much broader focus to CFIUS, for example, because it might dilute what is now a clear, strong, pointed focus. But it does allow for companies to create some really interesting models that don't trigger the national security concern right away. There are a variety of complex mechanisms for leveraging, for impacting companies that are not simply ownership, not simply acquisitions. You can have all kinds of debt arrangements that still give you all sorts of impacts on your quote-unquote investment, but it's not an investment under CFIUS rules, although CFIUS does recognize certain kinds of debt arrangements. But the market tends to be much more sophisticated than a statute at any point. It just moves much faster. So those kinds of things could be strengthened. I think on the cybersecurity side, we're still really making fundamental decisions as a country on what policies are we going to pursue in cybersecurity. Is there ever going to be an international treaty? Is that a better for us or worse for us, both from an economic and a national security perspective? But I think those decisions have to be made, and in particular about cybersecurity, because this is no longer the future. This is almost the near past now, and what we suffer and what our opportunities are already upon us. But I'd say that it's not, I agree very much with Alan in the sense that a lot of the laws are on the books. The decisions to implement those laws are more complex than simply saying you've got maybe one color of political party or another in power, and one is more pro-market and one is more pro, workers' rights or what have you. Because of the way we're structured, we're fundamentally always working with government and the market together, and with the private sector being very much part of the impact on the decision making. We're also not alone. We're a significant country, we're a significant economy, but there are very few things we could do on our own and really impact global policies. We've seen that in a variety of foreign policy contexts, and unless we're working together, in this case perhaps with Europe or with some of the other Asian countries. And that, I think, is the argument I hear for TPP, by the way, although I'm no expert on TPP, which is it's the relationships with some of those countries surrounding China that are so important and that could be really strengthened through any kind of agreement. But
as a former official, how do you see Vestager's reception in the U.S., which is, there's some positive and some negative, but there's a pretty fierce political blowback to what she's doing.
Well, this isn't the first, right? Look at what Europe did on data privacy in the past, 6 to 8 months. There's just been more activism, I think, coming out of Europe, and a real concern coming from U.S. companies that see this. And I think there's a bit of a worry from U.S. companies that, if these were French companies, would the same thing be happening? So there are some real, almost cultural differences in the way business and government interact, also between, on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay, so if anybody wants to respond, please do so, and then we'll open it up to questions. So does anybody want to respond to?
That's okay, just open it up.
All right. Can you just wait for the microphone? So we got.
Matt Miller with Capital Group. So kind of a question and a half for Ralph, but others may chime in. If you were going to say who's the political figure on the scene most inclined to take an America First trade policy against the globalism that's kind of rampant, it would be Trump. So I'm curious what your view is of Trump in this regard. And then second, for any U.S. president who was inclined to take a tougher tack with China on some of these things, are we now kind of 15 years into the WTO ascension with all the US-based multinationals having integrated China into their supply chains so thoroughly, as we've heard, will there now be politically, is it much tougher for any US president to be tougher on China because of a important constituency in the US of US CEOs of these global companies not wanting to rock the boat?
the first part of the question was,
What do you think of Trump?
I'll put it this way. The economic policies that I have advocated for a long time, I think have been represented this year by two people. One was Bernie Sanders, and one is Donald Trump. Okay? Right. I'm not trying to come out for Trump or come out for anyone else. I'm just making a statement about their economic policies being aligned with positions that I have had for a long time. You know. And now the second part was.
Any U.S. president who wants to get tougher on China?
It's tough. Yeah, I think you saw that when the Chinese Prime Minister came to the United States, was it 1 or 2 years ago? And he summoned the leaders of our major corporations to meet directly with him in Seattle. And they went, okay? And they went despite the fact that the President of the United States was opposed to that meeting, okay? Now, I think that gives you an idea that they feel very involved, and they are taking some leadership from China, and it will not be easy to change their policies because, by and large, whatever they're doing now, outsourcing or whatever else is, they're doing well, okay? And they would like to do better, but they think the way to do better is to get along with China. So I think getting tough in any sense will be extremely difficult because you will be getting tough against them.
So we'll take a couple of questions, and then.
Thank you, Paula Stern. I understand with regard to CFIUS, Elena, that you addressed some changes that might be made. And I'm wondering whether CFIUS needs to be reshaped and whether it requires congressional passage of new law, or whether there is wiggle room, in your legal opinion, for a different approach when it comes to the administration of the existing CFIUS law.
Thank you.
Wait, just one more question, and then we'll.
Pat Malloy and I think Paul and I are thinking along the same lines. I was general counsel of the Senate Banking Committee when we wrote the CFIUS law and put it in the 1988 trade bill. China was not a big item on our minds at that point. Since then, since China joined the WTO, they've run about $4 trillion worth of trade surpluses with the United States. So they have a lot of money to buy things in this country. So my question, since both you and Alan have talked about CFIUS, and you thought it should be covering Greenfield, I've been telling people on the Hill that I thought CFIUS needs a major look. And so what areas would you advise people in the Congress to look at in terms of strengthening the CFIUS process in the face of what we have as strategic purchases by China in this country?
Sure. Let me first say, when I think about CFIUS, I really don't. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there one more?
No.
Okay.
No.
I really don't come from a place of a single country, because I just think some things are cyclical, and I don't think it's helpful to focus on a particular country with statutes in any case. And obviously, you know, it's not really a trade law, so it can't account quite for some of the trade issues that have been discussed. And let me give one more caveat, because I'm a lawyer, which is, as with anything else, and this one I was talking about thinking globally about whatever we do, our economy wants foreign investment, right? I mean, it's important to us. And if we end up closing or make it much more difficult everywhere, and other advanced economies with attractive banking systems, attractive tax systems, attractive technology, et cetera, do not, then all we're doing is we're providing all kinds of impetus to offshore our companies. So I think that we always have to really think about who are we competing against? What's Germany doing, or what's somebody else like that doing? So with all those caveats, Greenfield. So a couple things. One is, to me, Greenfield is the glaring example. There were, when I was in, and I'm not allowed to talk about it because it was all classified, but let me just say there were all kinds of situations where we looked at investments. Well, one I could speak to, which is public, the Rawls wind case, for people who might not follow CFIUS all the time, was actually a remarkable legal case because it was a CFIUS investment that was not voluntarily filed as it's supposed to be. A Chinese investor in a wind farm in a very sensitive location near a very sensitive installation. And when it was found out, it was out, as it's called, unwound. And it took a presidential act, and there was a lawsuit about it, so it was significant. And, but, the conversation was, but had it not been a going concern, had you bought a plot of land and built a house on it, built anything, and particularly from a national security perspective, because we have our installations all over the country, and sometimes in very rural environments where it's hard to know what exactly is next door. Those are issues. Those are not the only issues. It's virtually impossible to close every kind of loophole, if you will, that's found by someone determined to do something. But Greenfield is definitely one that just kept coming up as, gosh, that's such an obvious. I think the more difficult things to deal with, and I have to say, having been on the inside, our intelligence community does a remarkable job of trying to figure out relationships, even when they're not on paper or in in an SEC filing. But you can't catch everything, and some things are not obvious, and sometimes the way transactions are structured are incredibly sophisticated and new, and and certainly new to the government people who've been working it. So some things can be done statutorily. Some things is just constantly keeping up with what is the market doing.
Yeah, just one last comment, and then we'll wrap it up.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll be very brief. I just think part of this, in terms of the issue about CFIUS and the potential competition between other states, so for the Europeans, I think Europe doesn't even have any CFIUS form of review at all. But what's really interesting is there is interest in developing such a review system. I think somebody mentioned earlier about Germany and the German concerns about strategic acquisition of German high technology companies. There is an interest in that, and I think the Europeans are moving down the route of developing a CFIUS program. So the more extensive that can be, the easier it is for the US to develop a flexible CFIUS system. And the idea of some degree of coordination on the standards would actually be very valuable. And you can see the parallel with the way that US and EU antitrust law have developed and cooperated over time. And that's something we should be able to look at developing. I'll stop there.
Well, I wanted to thank this really terrific panel, which was so. And also, I want to thank you all for coming today. It's been a long day. The conversation started a long time ago. This is a pretty rich set of subjects we gave you. It was some of it was pretty sobering. One promise is that this is just the start. We're going to have a series of conversations on these subjects. We're going to unpack some of the panels that you heard today. In fact, focusing on Haley's book. So those of you who are in town, we'd love to have you back tomorrow. And but anyway, this event, for anyone who didn't get enough of it, it's going to be available online, and you can go and watch it again. And actually, a lot of our audience we find are people who have been watching online, or will watch it, in the days to come. We often get hundreds or thousands of people watching these later. So anyway, thanks again, and there's cookies and coffee in the back.